The topic for this first chabura of the season is Wartime Gittin. This has unfortunately become once again a contemporary issue after the terrible tragedy of October 7th. There's a concern about addressing potential aguna situations. A man could go out into battle and become missing in action, where his whereabouts are unknown. Unfortunately, as we have seen, the people taken into captivity by the enemy, and the question about what steps should be taken to protect their wives from becoming an aguna is an old-time practice that's described as the practice of the Mechames Beis David in the wars of the time of David HaMelech, that when soldiers would go out to war, before they would depart, they would authorize or dispatch Gittin to be delivered to their wives, so that if something would happen to them, God forbid, in battle, that the wives would not become agunos. Maybe it would be a preemptive get, so that if they would die and there would be a brother who might not be so cooperative or available when it comes to yibum or chalitza, the wife wouldn't be stuck, even though we know the husband is dead, but at least this way she would be considered a grusha rather than almana. Or alternatively, even if it's not a yibum situation, you have a man we don't know whether he's dead or alive. So if a get was given, or would be given at a point in time in which we're not really sure, we could say mimanav shach. If he's dead, she's an almana. And if he's alive, so then the get which is being given, which was duly and properly authorized, will prevent his wife from becoming an aguna, because at least she'll be a grusha. It wouldn't help for the chalitza yibum situations, but it would help at least in terms of her not becoming an aguna through our not knowing whether the husband is dead or alive. This is a practice. This is a practice which, according to the Balaturim, Ala Torah in Parashas Matos, was already in practice way before the days of David HaMelech, already starting from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was authorizing the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, commanding them that they were obligated to go out to war, to fight the battle of conquering Eretz Yisrael if they wanted to inherit on the eastern. So when the Tanai was affirmed by the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain that they're going to join the battle of conquering Eretz Yisrael in order to inherit on the eastern side of the Yarden, they said, "Bavadecha yavu kochalutz tzava lifnei Hashem lamilchama." Kasher Adoni Dover, they're going to follow all of the terms. They're going to come across the Yarden and fight kochalutz tzava. So says the Balaturim, there are two terminologies like this in our Mesorahs, kol chalutz tzava and chalutz hanal. That's for the other time that we find the terminology chalutz. And he says, v'hainu de'aminan, and this is exactly what we say in the Gemara Ksuvas Daf Tes, Shabbos kol yotzei l'melchemes beis David ges krisus kosev liishto. Anybody went out to the war amongst the battles of David HaMelech, he would first write a get for his wife, shel tizakek liyovam, v'lo tistarech, so that she shouldn't be in a situation of yibum and chalitza if, God forbid, the husband would die. V'lo tistarech laklos nali hayavam, and she wouldn't have to take off and do chalitza, to do chalutza now, to be in a situation where she's dependent on the cooperation of the brother-in-law for chalitza. B'shamina mikan, says the Balaturim, shigam Moshe asakein. So we see from here that even Moshe made this type of policy where soldiers who would go to war would authorize a get for the wives. Mimeno lama David, and this is where David got it from. David didn't make it up himself. B'zeh kol chalutz tzava. That's why it says avadecha yavu kol chalutz tzava pirush chalutz hanal. That it's a direct connection and correlation with the situation of Yibum, certainly, which is one of the major goals that's mentioned in connection with why there was this policy of commissioning Gittin at war. Rashi and Ksuvos actually says that since you look in the Gemara in Ksuvos, it gives us a pasuk where we have an allusion to this that refers to Yishai, Avi David, sending out David HaMelech to check on his brothers when they were at war. It says, that you should bring greetings to your brothers, and you should take their pledge, take their tidings. Arubasam tikach, there certainly sounds like take their pledge. Myres arubasam tikach, what exactly type of pledge was it that he's taking? Tani of Yosef dvarim hamuravim beino lebeino. Arubasam is a lashon of the things that are between the husband and the wife that he was bringing to them, Gittin Mechama, to see to it that they would take care of the requisite authorizations for a get to be commissioned for their wives. So Rashi points out that David HaMelech himself learned this practice from his father Yishai. And where did Yishai get it from? So the Baal Turim says this was a long honored practice that went back all the generations from the giving of the Torah. It came all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, very, very time-honored practice. So one thing that this teaches us is that if we assume, like the Baal Turim is saying, but even if we just trace it to Melchemes Beis David, we see that there is an age-old notion of figuring out creative ways to do Gittin in order to prevent aguna situations. This is very much built into the ethos of our Torah. It's not some newfangled idea that we have to help out the agunas. No, the mishum agunat akilu be'rabanan. It's an age-old concept. Shlo yu benos Yisrael agunos. These are all concepts mentioned over and over again by the Gemara. These are all things which are very ingrained in the culture of the Torah. Every single time you do a get in a creative way, it has to be kedasu gedin, of course. But the idea of coming up with special ways of doing a get and ensuring that the get happens so the wife not be an aguna has ample precedent. That's one very important concept that we see from the whole institution of wartime Gittin, of this idea of every single body, everybody who went out to war as a soldier, get krisus kosev liishto, as the Gemara in Ksuvos and Daf Tes Samad Aleph says. The Sefer Chinuch, in Mitzvah Tov Kuf Ayin Tes, from the pasuk psukim that speak about the mitzvah of writing a get that we just read in last week's parsha, Parshas Kiteitzin and Yona Yoma. So he writes that one of the Tamei HaMitzvos for a get is that a woman should not be precipitously divorced. That if you do have a viable, functional marriage, if we have a husband who loses his temper, that he shouldn't just suddenly and precipitously, without good reason, end a marriage which is otherwise functional. In other words, according to this explanation of the Sefer Chinuch, a get is really the opposite of how it's unfortunately sometimes used today as a weapon by a husband at the end of a marriage which is clearly over. He's going to hold up the get until he gets the concessions that he wants from his wife. So obviously, we see that if one of the primary reasons, or the tamei mitzvahs for the get, was to protect the woman, so for sure, it shouldn't be used in opposite fashion, as a weapon against the woman when she needs to be released from a non-functional marriage. But it's also, if you look at the first reason that the Sefer Chinuch gives for why there's such an institution as the get, we just don't send away a wife at the conclusion of the marriage, like the Rambam writes in Hilchos Malachim Perek Tes, that the way that non-Jews end the marriage is that the husband says, goodbye, please leave the house, or the wife leaves on her own, and whenever there's just a leaving of the house without any kind of pomp or ceremony, the marriage ends automatically. Why is that? Because there's no kiddushin, there's no lashon hekdesh, there's no sanctity to the marriage, which is conferred upon that type of a secular situation. But we have a sacred marriage, so the get is a reminder that the marriage means something, and that it's supposed to be maintained with a certain level of sanctity. So it's also important that the get not be used as a tool for licentiousness or immorality. So we see there are two things really from the Sefer HaChinuch. One is that the get's not supposed to be used by the husband as a weapon, but secondly, that the get is also not supposed to be something which is clamored for so that people can be promiscuous and can do things which are immoral. And the get milchama is really cognizant of both of these concerns. In terms of its purpose, number one, which is to protect the woman, and in terms of the various concerns that are registered by the Rishonim, by later poskim, with different approaches about how to do a get milchama. That it shouldn't be a license for znus or a mikshol for immorality either. So there are two classical approaches in Rishonim about how the get milchama was done. The way it's described in Maseches Ksuvos, you have Rashi and you have Rabbeinu Tam. From Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, you have the modern day conventions of how a get milchama is done, or even those who argue that it shouldn't be done altogether. But it's important to start off with the original classical approaches so that we can branch out from them. Each one has potential advantages and has potential pitfalls. Rashi writes that the get was done al tanai. That he could get krisos kosev lishto shim yamus mamacham ye get miyom ksibaso. That was the case of that. The Gemara's context is how could David HaMelech have been with Bathsheba? Bathsheba was married to Uriah, right? So the Gemara talks about why didn't Bathsheba become prohibited to her husband? One teretz maybe was bonus, and the second teretz is no. It was based upon this idea that there was a get that was given, and she wasn't really an Ashes Ish. That's what it sounds like with the Gemara. She wasn't really an Ashes Ish at the time that David HaMelech had relations with her. And Rashi says, yeah, because Uriah had written a get before he went out to battle, that in the event that he would die, that then retroactively it's going to be a get miyom ksibaso. So we all know what happened to Uriah, right? Uriah Kiti ended up dying, right? So since he died at war, so it turned out retroactively that she was divorced from the very beginning of the war, and therefore when David HaMelech had relations with Bathsheba, she was not an Ashes Ish at that point in time. So there are problems that Rabbeinu Tam poses with respect to Rashi's approach. Problem number one is that first of all, how could this be? Rashi says Shim Yamus b'Mochama, that in the event that the husband would die, so then the get is going to become retroactive. So it sounds like it's only something that we really care about if we want the woman to be a grusha and not to be an almana, that we're going to know that the husband died at war. If he died at war, she has another good reason why she's allowed to remarry, because she's an almana, right? So why then would you need to write this special get that says, call hayos to the Mochemes based of it? Everybody. Sounds like whether they were single or married, they're single, they have a brother, they don't have a brother, they have a large family, don't have a large family. Sounds like everybody's writing these Gittin. Not only those people for whom there was a chashash that it's going to create some type of concern that she's going to fall into the realm of yibum and chalitza. No. So that's the first kasha. So you can say that it's lav dafka. So Tosa says maybe you would learn that it's lav dafka. The second kasha that Tosos has, so we have the girsa v'od. The second kasha is that if there is a get that's given al tanai, the Gemara in Gittin Daf Ayin Gimel says that if the man says, I want the get to be chal right away in mati, if I'm going to die, so Rabbi Yehuda says that she is considered to be an Ashes Ish, the chol dvareh, that she's considered to be an Ashes Ish during that period of time, because what he really means is that the get should be chal 1 minute before he dies. So even in the event that the Uriah, the husband, would die at sometime during the war, the get's not going to be chal retroactively from the time of the ksiva. The Maharsha says, based on this concern that we mentioned before, why would you want it to be chal from the time of the ksiva? What possible advantage is that going to have? The advantage is simply going to be that the wife is going to know, now I have a good chance I can engage in promiscuous relationships, and if in the event that the husband dies, it'll turn out that I didn't do a sin. So it's just going to lead to the possibility of greater licentiousness. That's not something that we would encourage. Therefore, it's generally assumed that the get, in any event, is not going to be chal to the end of the war. So Tosas gives an answer. Tosas says, yeah, but that's different if the person is pirish behedya. If he says explicitly that the get should be chal from the time of the ksiva, so then it's going to be chal from the time of the ksiva. And furthermore, he says that we don't have to worry so much about the sugya of mehayomi mati, because we already said in the first answer, right, that it's lav dafka. The idea of imati, that wasn't really the formulation. The formulation was that the man was saying, if anything should happen to me, there'll be death, or he's taken into captivity and nobody knows exactly what happened to him, and his wife is going to be stuck. In all of these scenarios, he wanted to protect his wife. That's why it wouldn't only be a married, well, obviously it's only a married man who's going to do it. I don't know why he says single, but obviously it's only a married man who's going to do it. But it doesn't matter whether he has a brother, doesn't have a brother, has children, doesn't have children. Every single man is going to all of the married men who are yotzin the mecheres beis David are going to write this get, and it's not going to be just a imati situation, but whatever happens, and therefore the Tanai was that the get should be chal from the time of the ksiva. But then you have a curious question, which is that wouldn't it be a suffix still that maybe he's not going to die, and therefore it'll turn out that there really isn't a get altogether, and that the woman would be an Ashish Ish. So how could David then have had relations with Bathsheba altogether? We have a statement in the Gemara called Omer David Chata Eno Ela Toet. You say David died, David sinned. So that you're making a mistake. David never sinned. So the answer is, well, that's why the Gemara says that David was criticized because he had relations with a suffix Eshish. So what does it mean? He had relations. That's what it says in Gemara Baba Matzia Daf Nun Tes. He had relations with a suffix Eshish. So that's why. That's exactly what she was. It's true that at the end he was vindicated in a way because Uriah died, so the get was chal retroactively. So she wasn't really an Ashish Ish, but she certainly was a suffix Ashish Ish. The question as well is that didn't Uriah actually return home? So that's the last question that Tosfos asks, and Tosfos gives the teretz that even though Uriah actually returned, and this is a very important point with respect to the question nowadays of furloughs, that you have soldiers who may authorize a get, and then they're going to come back and they're given time off. We know that in the current war in Eretz Yisrael, the soldiers are sometimes given off a Shabbos to go back to their wives and so forth. So what do you do in that type of situation? So Tosfos points out that even though it's true that he came back, since he didn't come back besofa milchama, didn't come back at the very, very end of the war. Therefore, despite the fact that he came back in the middle, that would not put a kibosh. It would not be a nullification of the Tanai, because the Tanai was only in the event that Uriah would not return at the end of the war. It would still be an effective get, even if he would return home sometime during the middle of the war. That would not nullify the Tanais. This is a very important concept, a very important idea. That somehow you can keep the Tanai going, even in the event that the husband would come back in the middle. So that's a possible teretz with respect to Rashi Shita. However, Rabbeinu Tam, cognizant of all of the kushios, all of the kashas that we have with respect to the doing a get al Tanai, particularly the idea that David's going to have relations with a woman who, if the husband doesn't die, it'll turn out that she's an Ashish Ish Gemura. Tosfos says, you know what really happened? And this is the idea of a get milchama. What really happened is that there was an absolute 100% get that was given, and that's what it means that every single person would write a get. We know off the bat what's going to be a major problem with this particular Eitzah. The major problem is you'll say, oh, so that's a great idea. This way she's definitely divorced, and if he should die, so there won't be a Yibum issue, and we don't have to worry if he goes missing in action because she's divorced anyway, so she's allowed to remarry. We don't know if he's dead, if he's alive, doesn't matter. she's divorced, so it solves a lot of problems. It obviously doesn't solve the problem of a Kohen. You had a Kohen, and he gives his wife again, he's never going to be allowed to marry her again. But this was Rabbeinu Tam's solution that it's best. You're going to prevent a woman from being an aguna. You know, the best way of preventing a woman from being an aguna, give an absolute get. Don't have tricks or games or conditions, because there are pitfalls when you do any of these things. I learned this very early on in my career in Beis Din, that there used to be a policy the Beis Din would do. Maybe this was inherited from I don't know when, but people trying to be creative, trying to convince a man to give a get when the wife is nervous that she's not going to give a get at the end of the civil divorce, not that she needs it right away, but it doesn't want him to use it as a weapon. So the agreement was, he'll give a get right now, but the Beis Din's not going to deliver the get. Shliach's not going to deliver the get until the end of the civil divorce, until something happens. And it would get very confusing, because first of all, you had the possibility the husband would say, no, divorce isn't really over yet. Everything has to be resolved. And who says that everything is really resolved? And you have to worry, God forbid, about bittul. And we had one case where the wife was livid because the civil divorce dragged out for 5 years, and the Beis Din made a gentleman's agreement, shall we say, that it's not going to deliver the get until the end of the civil divorce. And the woman went to every single public forum that she could find, and every single media outlet that she could find, and say, the Beis Din is making me an aguna. The Beis Din is holding up my get, and they're making me an aguna. So I instituted very early on, we're going to do a get ayidei shliach. The husband's going to authorize a get to be given. He's going to give a get over to the shliach. I said, I don't want a husband giving a get to the shliach unless he authorizes the shliach to deliver it right away. Unless the understanding is the get is going to be delivered immediately. Every now and then, maybe, it's justified to make an exception in very, very extreme circumstances to that principle. But that's the general rule that we have followed. It comes up also in cases where you're worried the husband right now has a capacity. However, you're worried that he's not always going to have capacity. We have several cases like this going back, 25 years ago. I just had a case like this right now. I was discussing with Rabbi Willick a few weeks ago, a fellow in the early stages of Alzheimer's. It's not that the couple's not getting along. Sometimes it's a part of it too. But generally speaking, you have a couple that's getting along, but the husband is losing his mental capacity. When he's going to lose his mental capacity, Rachmana litzlan, he's not going to be able to give his wife a get. He's not even going to recognize her anymore. He may even have to be institutionalized. He may be in an institution for 20, 30 years, depending on his age, when he comes down with Alzheimer's, in which there's absolutely no marital life or existence, or even connectivity between the husband or the wife. And the husband wants to spare his wife from being in that type of situation, wants to give her a get, but if he gives her a get, he's not going to be able to be with her anymore. So what do? You give a get conditionally? So that's a very, very iffy to be able to give a get condition. You have all of these different pitfalls, plus, as we'll discuss shortly, it's not so pashut to make a tanai in a get. The Rambam says you're not allowed to write a tanai in the get at all. And if it's discussed even before that the sofer and the Eidim know about it, then it could create problems with the validity of the get. A lot of problems with respect to a tanai in the get. That's why Rabbi Yechiel Paris put an end to this practice, says we're not doing tanaim in Gittin anymore. So what do you do in this situation? So Rav Gedaliah Dov Schwartz Zatzal instituted in these Alzheimer's cases, he said, what are we worried about? We're worried that this couple, they still have a loving relationship, and once the get is given, the wife's going to have to leave the home. So he said, maybe she doesn't have to leave the home. You have a doctor's note. You have it from a reliable physician saying that because of the man's illness, and this is very common in Alzheimer's situations, he's incapable of having marital relations. There's no Isser Yichud anymore. The wife's not allowed to engage in Chibuk v'Nishuk, but there's no Isser Yichud if there's no possibility of Bia. But Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva in Chelik Daled Siman Samachei Anaf Yud in Even HaEzer, which he says, even he disagrees with the Zayas Ranan. Zayas Ranan says the man's not capable, so then it will permit Yichud Rabbanim but not Deraisa, Moshe, nothing doing. We'll permit Yichud Deraisa, Moshe Sternberg, Chuvas on Huggers, Chelakei, Simon Shin Lamed Aleph, same thing, no problem of Yichud. If you have a man who's really incapable of having relations, for good measure, Rav Gedayah would throw in that it should be a situation where there's also another attendant living full-time in the house. Again, I don't know that necessarily makes a huge difference. Once you have a situation where the man is simply not able to have relations anymore, in this way, the simplest solution in the Alzheimer's case, some wanted to say, do a get and al tanai, it'll only be effective when the man is no longer capable of mental of having mental capacity. Al tanai, as I said, very, very complicated to do, so that we don't really do. So this is the simplest solution. What if you just have the man authorize a get to be written at the point in time in which he's going to be incapacitated? So if a get is written when the man is incapacitated, that's the discussion. The Torah Shulchan Aruch Siman Kov Chaf Aleph, the Torah says, you know what we call such a get? Batul. Call such a get batul. The Rambam says the get is possible. The Beis Shmuel suggests maybe if the get would be written, it's only given over at a later point in time. Maybe even the Torah would agree it's not batul, but still be possible. You're not saving anything under those circumstances. There were some who wanted to have husbands, let's say, who are going in for major surgery or where there is some sort of a condition which is going to deteriorate, like Alzheimer's and the like, to simply authorize that a get should be written at such point in time in which they no longer have mental capacity. Both the Rambam and the Torah say it doesn't work. Only a question whether it's batul or pasul. So they wanted to argue something else. Maybe you're not writing it from the standpoint of shlichus. You're writing it from the standpoint of zachin. You say zachin. Zachin to be a suchus, an unmitigated suchus that the man wants his wife to be able to go on. That it shouldn't be that he is leaving. That he should be to blame. That she's going to be stuck in this world without a husband because of his terrible illness, so based on Zachin. So that was the famous case of Tzfat, of the get from Tzfat, where there was a husband who became basically in a vegetative state, and there was a very long decision that was written by the Bezdin in Tzfat at the time, only proving the principle that the more words that you write doesn't make the reasoning any more compelling. That where they had no really good argument, they tried to bunch together like 5 havaminas from different shuvas that were all rejected and make it into a maskana, and say that you could have a get written based on zachin the adam shlo b'fanav. Never mind, the Ktso says that get is always zachin me adam shlo b'fanav. Well, he says you only say zachin the adam, it's not zachin me adam. To have a get written on behalf of the husband is considered he's not receiving the get, he's giving the get. It's zachin me adam. But leaving that aside, you need a higher level of das. When it comes to the giving of the get, the zechiyah, the coming from the husband to give a get, is simply not something which has ever been accepted by the poskim, other than a fleeting havaminas in this tshuva or that tshuva, but not something which is accepted. But some wanted to say, well, nonetheless, since one of the criticisms of the Tzfat case was who says that the husband would have wanted the get to be written, so have the husband say explicitly, if he's ever in a vegetative state, he would want the get to be written, and then maybe there'll be something to discuss. So I once was writing an article in Techumen where there was a proposal that I strongly disagreed with, that some people were making, my good friend Rabbi Boyd and a couple of others, to do what they call a tripartite agreement, where at the beginning of every marriage, a husband would authorize that if they get separated, a get should be written, and he's authorizing Afkinum Rabban L'Kiddushim. And I don't know, arguments that really don't fly off the ground. You can't make up a private Afkinum Rabban L'Kiddushim. That's something that has to be established by all of the Chachamim, probably something that has to appear in the Gemara. And they threw in for a good measure that there's also going to be a not only a like an authorization that and a tanai in the get, that the get is going to be automatically unravel in the event that he doesn't give a get within a certain period of time. We say ein tanai b'nisuin. It was 0 + 0 + 0, basically none of these different ideas of Kafkiinu, Tanai, or Harshaf, or get to be written in the future, really had any validity whatsoever with the couple living together and all that afterwards. But I wrote, just as giving a little bit of a carrot at the end of my article in Tuchumin, in which I really lambasted this idea. They wrote with this tripartite agreement. The title of the article was called V'achuta meshulash lo v'mheira yinasek. So I wrote a rejoinder tshuva called V'im shlosh eila lo yaseh lo. So at the very conclusion, I wrote, look, you're trying to maybe address certain other types of situations where we don't know that the husband is screaming and yelling, don't give the get, which is the biggest problem with this solution, that the husband's yelling, don't give the get. So he was mevatel for sure, anything that he authorized beforehand. So you have the case of a husband with sickness. You want to talk about having some pre-authorization. It doesn't seem like it works lahalacha, but that's something that at least we can talk about in such a situation. If there's anything that could potentially work under those circumstances. If it's possible midrabanan, maybe we can to try to figure out how to raise it up a notch. So there's a certain rabbi, very fine rav, in Beit Shemesh, who is very involved in mental health issues, and he wanted very much to come up with such a harsha, such an idea of a man who has mental illness making harsha for a get to be written at a later time. So he wrote me like a note that he really liked the fact that I threw that into my proposal, but I said it was just something I was writing for. I have no idea how such a thing would work. I don't think that it works. I just said something that maybe somebody will come up with a better idea. But anyway, he, as we will see, was so keen on this idea that he actually thought that it's a good idea to have a harsha that includes this type of a provision. I told him I don't think that it actually works. So certainly right now our assumption is that such a thing doesn't work. There's no shita that I could turn to that would say such a thing works. So what we would do in the Alzheimer's cases is we have the husband give an absolute unconditional get, and sometimes the wife is allowed to remain on the premises to help take care of the husband in limited form, to provide moral support and the like. Based on the considerations of yichud not being applicable under those circumstances. That's how Rav Gedaliah Dov Schwartz felt. So Rabbi Jachter, in an article that he wrote about this subject, he notes that Rabbi Peretz Steinberg, Shlita from Queens, once had a situation where a man was going in for very perilous surgery, where there was a chance that he might be mentally incapacitated at the end of the surgery, and he wanted to protect his wife and do some sort of a conditional get if it shouldn't work out. But if it wouldn't work out, you couldn't write a get afterwards. So how is that going to work? And we don't do a get out tonight to give over the get right away and say it's only going to be chal afterwards. So Rabbi Steinberg said, have him give the get. Have him give the get before the surgery. If the surgery doesn't work out, she has a get. If the surgery works out, he wasn't a Kohen, fortunately. I don't know what he would do if he was a Kohen. He wasn't a Kohen, they can get remarried. Baruch Hashem kachava. The surgery worked out, and said, Siman Tov Mazel Tov. They got remarried, and they had new chuppah v'kiddushin, and shalom Yisrael. Now, the question is, according to Rabbeinu Tam, why is it called a Safek Eishes situation by the Gemara in Baba Metzia Daf Nuntes? So he explains, let me tell you why it was called Safek Eishes. Because when the husbands would give their wives unconditional gittin, it was done b'tzina. You know why? It was done privately. So therefore, even though it was the general practice that every soldier would authorize the get, you wouldn't know for sure. Maybe this husband didn't want to do it. Maybe he was absent that day. Maybe they didn't get around to it. So whatever. So because of the fact that it wasn't well publicized, it was called a suffix. Why wasn't it well publicized? Because they didn't want to encourage promiscuity. If it would be well publicized, this is, as I said, the other side of the coin. We want to protect the women, but we don't want to do it, and therefore, in a way that's going to promote promiscuity. So safek means that simply that nobody could be absolutely sure that it was done. Maybe, by the way, just a suggestion, I don't know this, but maybe the idea was that they didn't coerce it. When we had this principle of the kol yosem mochemes beis David get krisos kosev lishto, it wasn't as if you had the taskmasters standing over them with their whips, saying, if you don't give it a get, we're going to whip you, because then that could result in a get musa. That could result in a get musa. That was one of the reservations that was expressed by certain Rabbanim at the beginning of the formation of the modern state of Israel in 1948, when the Rabbanut really wanted to have every single husband authorize the get. And the Rabbanim, some of the Rabbanim at the time, I think including Rabbi Goren, expressed, certain reservations about it. And one of the reservations was, it could be a get me'usah if we're going to require everybody to do it. I think that Yosef Shlomo Levin at the time said, no, if this is the halakha that they're supposed to do it, that's not considered to be get me'usah. But maybe there's a point to it, that the idea was that it was something which was encouraged, that you could show up and then the Bezdin would write the get, but it wasn't something which was absolutely necessary, something were absolutely required. It wasn't mandatory. So that may also help to fit in with this explanation of Tosfos, that it still leads to Safek Eshes, because, it was generally done, but you couldn't know. It was Bitsina, so you couldn't know, it wasn't publicized. You couldn't assume that any particular person had definitely do it, right? Okay. And this relates as well, the idea of doing the get unconditionally right away, so you're not going to have problems later on, of course relates to the entire issue. Not going to devote an entire chabura to it, because I don't think it deserves an entire chabura. I thought about it a little bit. But the question of the timing of the get. That nowadays, it's many Batei Din have the practice, we know that a couple is definitely getting civilly divorced. They're definitely getting divorced. Leave aside, they get a civil divorce. Maybe they were never civilly married. Civil divorce is not the ikar. But we make sure that we do the get early on in the proceedings. There was a letter that was signed by Rav Gedaliah Dov Schwartz or Schechter or others back in the year 2000 already, which said that, and this is on the Bezdin of America website, okay? That's not a halakhic source per se, but it's on the website, as just policies and procedures. Because there was a desire to get many Rabbanim at that time together to articulate certain policies and procedures, and they agreed that the procedure would be that, as a general rule, whenever it's clear that the parties are getting divorced, we're going to do the get, we're going to do the get up front. The get should be the first thing. Why is that? Because you're preventing problems down the road. What Rav Henkin did, what Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin wrote in the Hapardes, related to a civil divorce, where people were under the mistaken notion that they thought a get couldn't be done before the conclusion of a civil divorce, and therefore he said it's created terrible pitfalls. It created pitfalls because sometimes you had couples who weren't so observant, and maybe they would forget about the get. Once the civil divorce would be finished, they go their separate ways, out of sight, out of mind. They weren't so religiously inclined altogether. They might forget to do the get. And secondly, he pointed out, and this is so true, as divorces go on, they tend to get more and more acrimonious. Therefore, even if at the beginning there was a willingness to give the get, not necessarily so much towards the end. Therefore, it's a good idea to do the get, at the very beginning. But I have to emphasize, I looked at his mimer again. I've read it a few times. I looked at his mimer recently. It was published in Hapardes. What was it, the 1950s, I think. So I looked at his mimer again, and his focus is not on doing the get before all the monetary issues and custodial issues are decided and are resolved. His focus is that it's okay and a good idea to do the get prior to the civil divorce. That's all. He didn't talk about the get if you have a proceeding where you're taking care of all the issues. We know that Moshe certainly seemed to work with the assumption you've taken care of all the other issues before you do the get. Not that part, not so pashut. But as Rav Melech Schechter said, and others who were very involved in Gittin over the years, that based on what they saw, and this is consistent with the logic and the reasoning of what Rav Henkin wrote in the context of the civil divorce situation, they saw that it was increasingly harder to get the get done as the divorce would drag out, and that would create a greater potential for aguna situations. Better to do the get up front. You might have a taina that the husband will say, it was a get muta. I wouldn't have given the get had I known that I would be reamed in terms of the financial claims that would come up afterwards. So just as the Aruch HaShulchan writes in the Seder get, just make it clear at the time the get's given that it has nothing to do with whether you're happy or not with the resolution of the other issues afterwards, that it's completely separate and independent from that, and make that very clear. and have that acknowledged. As long as you have that acknowledged, so that would be all fine and good. Now, getting back to this approach of Rabbeinu Tam, which often solves a lot of problems. As I mentioned, we know for sure it's not going to solve the problem where if you have a loving couple, then the husband's going out to war and hopefully he'll come back and he's a Kohen, so then they're going to be out of luck with respect to this solution. But the idea that we avoid the Tanaim, as I mentioned, completely consistent with the Shita of Yechiel Paris, who said that there used to be a standard practice with a Shchiv Meirah. Shchiv Meirah, a man on his deathbed, but sometimes he would turn around, he would rally, and he would get better. But if he wouldn't, and they were worried about Chalisa situations, he had a brother from Medina Sayyam, China, whatever. He is somebody who we don't expect to ever hear from, and if the wife is going to need a Chalisa from him, forget it, she's going to be stuck forever. So the Shchiv Meirah would give a get out tonight. The get will be good if he dies. In the event that he doesn't die, so then the get won't be good. So Yechiel Paris said, we're not going to do that anymore because we have problems with Tanaim. The Rif holds you can't. The get's going to be puzzle. Even though it doesn't seem to go along with our Gemaras. The get's going to be puzzle if you write a Tanai anywhere in the get, in the text of the get, in the back of the get, in the bottom of the get is going to be puzzle for sure. And the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch hold that Sofer and Eidim are not supposed to know about it. It has to only be mentioned at the time of the Nesina. Very, very, very complicated to do a get out tonight properly, particularly if everyone, the Sofer and the Eidim, know what's really going on. So even if they weren't told, maybe it's as if they were really told. So he said, we're not doing it anymore. We're not doing a get out tonight anymore. What? Never done a get out tonight. Never done a get out tonight. And in fact, the Aruch HaShulchan writes, he's never heard of such a thing. He's never heard. He writes, for all of these reasons, we don't do get out tonight. And he says, in my entire career, the Aruch HaShulchan had an illustrious Bezdin career. He knew the world of Bezdin. He was very, very involved in Batei Din. The first chalik of Aruch HaShulchan is Choshe Mishpat. He was one of the great mumchim in the Bezdin world. Never heard of a get done out tonight. Never heard of such a thing. Never heard of it being done. So said Rabbi Yechiel Paris. That's it. From now on, what we're going to do with respect to a Shchiv Meirah case is, man's on his deathbed, is just going to give an absolute get to his wife. Absolute get to his wife. If he's a Kohen, okay, then out of luck. But not a Kohen, so they make promises with each other that if he should get better, she'll remarry him. All kinds of promises. Yeah, maybe she'll have to pay knossos if she doesn't remarry him. Maybe you can do all those things perfectly fine. That's what led to the famous Get Mivaina controversy of 1611. The get from Vienna, okay, that there was a big, big controversy. It was a get involving a relative in the Maharam Lublin. One of the Mesadrei Gittin was the Sma, none other than the Sma. And the man was a 16-year-old boy, and he was on his deathbed. And he gave an absolute get to his wife with all kinds of promises. Oh yeah, if you get better, I love you so much, I'll get remarried to you right away. Don't worry, all is good. They took all kinds of shavuos, whatever promises to remarry. And then the young man got better and his wife got wiser. She decided, I am not going to remarry this fellow. And the Maharam Lublin said, oh no. So if you don't do that, you're going to violate your promise. It's as if this get was given out tonight, you violated tonight, the get is bottled. The get is no good. That's what the Maharam Lublin said. He was joined by the Lavush, and a lot of illustrious rabbis got involved in this fight, who were involved in the time, who were alive at the time. The Lavush joined forces, at least temporarily, joined forces with the Maharam Lublin. On the other side of the equation, you had the Sma, who is a Mesadri. He was one of the Mesadrin. And he said, no, this get is perfectly fine. That's one of the advantages of giving an unconditional get that's not out tonight. The get remains good. If she violated, it's not okay. So maybe she owes him money, whatever. She violated what she violated. There are consequences for violating, but it does not apostle the get in any way. And the Sma had on his side the Bach, had on his side the Marsha, had on his side the Kliyakar. A lot of very, very prominent Rabbanim. 1611 was a good time for big Rabbanim. Okay, they were all around, all involved in this controversy. They all said, no harm, no foul. It was an unconditional get. She had freedom of choice. There was a major convocation of Rabbanim about this issue. They had a big Yom Iyun, whatever was the equivalent of Yeshiva University at the time. everybody got together, and they all came out in favor of the Sma and his contingent. The Maharam Lublin, to his deathbed, never retracted his position. Eventually, he lost his rabbinical post. In those days, it was perilous to be too much of a machmir. It's not like today. Maharam Lublin, he said, he's too much of a machmir, that's it. He's out of a job, out of a job. So the Maharsha, writing about this case, says, oh, you know where Rav Yechiel MiPariz, that's source 6, you know where Rav Yechiel MiPariz got this from? You know where he got this from? He said, Amarti ki yesodahu be'atzmo ma shapira shabeinu tam betosos. What Rabbeinu Tam says, the Kol HaYosef Mochemes Beis David, that they used to give a get gomer. That was exactly where Rav Yechiel MiPariz, who lived 100 years after Rabbeinu Tam, this is where he got his yesod from, that we stay away. There are too many pitfalls with respect to doing a get al tanai. Therefore, you should do an absolute get. And the Aruch HaShulchan, as I mentioned, said that he never heard of such a thing, of a get being done al tanai. Okay. Even the Aruch HaShulchan said, if you're going to do it, you have to really figure out how to do it in such a way in which you're not saying anything to anybody, even to the shliach. You don't tell the shliach to deliver it out tonight. You just like tell the shliach, oh, this is what I really want. And then at the time, you know, that you're giving the get to the shliach, you say, Aseke chakmascha. Aseke chakmascha, like David HaMelech said to his son, right? They said to Shlomo HaMelech, you know, when he was turning over the reins, Aseke chakmascha, okay. But not to actually give any explicit type of tanai condition. You know, we've had cases like that when you have to do something like holding on to a get until the civil divorce. That's another pitfall. How do you avoid these ideas of a tanai, that you shouldn't mention the tanai outright, you might do it the wrong way? You have to do it as this like gentleman's agreement with the husband, the husband, we tell the husband, in those cases I've been involved, he authorizes, the shliach says, I'm authorizing you, and we say you have to authorize him to give the get on condition, no strings attached. You can give the get right away, and then we say privately to the husband, but don't worry, we remember what we discussed about, you know, we're waiting for the civil divorce. It's not, that's another problem of having an authorization where there's an expectation the get's not going to be given until something happens, and having these gentlemen's agreements. Who knows if you're doing that kedas or kedin? Another reason why whenever you have a get which is actually written, it should be written in such a way that it's ready to be given over right away, given to the shliach. It shouldn't be any strings attached or any other types of expectations. Very, very, very important. I've come over the years, now over a quarter century, I've been involved in Gittin. I've only come to solidify this conclusion. Very, very important to stay away from any kinds of strings attached, even gentlemen's agreements, things of that sort. Better things should be unconditional, consistent with Rabbeinu Tam, consistent with Rav Yechiel MiPariz. However, as we mentioned, when it comes to the get milchama, this idea of the unconditional get, so it presents its own pitfalls, as is pointed out by the Divrei Malkiel, pointed out by others, that number one, you have, in addition to the Kohen problem, you have logistical nightmare. You have, it's like, think of Kaparos and Erev Yom Kippur. You have all of these fellows that are about to go out to war, and they all want these Gittin to be written. I mean, come on, how many sofrim are you going to have? How many sofrim? And Mordechai Javahari can tell you. Not so easy to find competent sofrim, you know, who are going, and then they're going to have to what? They write like 10 Gittin over the course of the day? Not so easy, and then you have to make sure you get all the shemos correct. You're not going to get tired out. You're not going to get confused. You're going to do everything properly. It's going to be a logistical and bureaucratic nightmare to write so many gittins. That's problem number one. Problem number two. Problem number one is it doesn't work for a kohen, and the problem number three is you have the Vienna situation. You have a situation where the expectation is you're giving an unconditional get. And then the wife is going to want to remarry the husband when he comes back to war. But let's say she's not going to. And also, this could create a problem in terms of morale. Mem Vav Reish Lamed. I've learned this, morale. Okay, it's going to create a problem in terms of morale that the husbands, you know, when they're out there fighting. Now, it's true, the Rambam says you're not supposed to think of your wives, your families, or anything, but when you're thinking to yourself, who knows what my wife is up to? I don't know that she doesn't even have a wife anymore. The ex-wife, maybe she's never going to remarry again. That could hurt a little bit of that fighting spirit that the husband is supposed to have as a soldier. And number 4, you have the problem of the furlough situations that at least nowadays this is a very, very common thing, that the soldiers are allowed to come home every once in a while. If she's no longer his wife, so he's not going to be allowed to enter the door. He's not going to be able to be with her unless he remarries her. He remarries her, so you're back to square one. So what have you really resolved? So in terms of the bureaucratic nightmare, the David HaMelech dealing with the bureaucratic nightmare, he was dealing with the Russo-Japanese War, I think in 1905. So he said we could do what's known as a get nechpos. Discover one of the forms of Gittin that we have. We have a regular boilerplate get from a miyad liyad, from the husband to the wife. That's our regular get. Then we have a get ayidei shliach. The husband delivers the get through a shliach to his wife. Variations of that. He could deliver it to a shliach above the wife. We don't really do shliach kabbalah, almost never. That will do once in a blue moon. Get out tonight, not even once in a blue moon. Get a shliach kabbalah once in a blue moon. Then you have your third type, which is a get nechpos, where the husband authorizes the get, but he doesn't even hand it to the shliach. He just authorizes the sofer. Hey, you sofer, go write a get. You Adam, go sign a get. You shliach, go take this get on my behalf and deliver it to my wife, and I am out of here. And he leaves, okay? Sometimes you have this, where these busy businessmen are not so interested in halacha. They'll do the get as a favor to the wife. He says, I only have 15 minutes. I only have 15 minutes. Wait, 15 minutes. Get takes at least an hour and a half. So 15 minutes. All you can do is the get nechbas. Then he makes the authorizations and he runs out the door. But the get can be written later that day. It can be written the next day. It can be written a month from now. It can be written 6 months from now. It can be written a year from now. No rush. So David HaMelech says that's what you save. You don't have to shack the chicken right now. You can just have the authorization, and then the get is going to be written at a later point in time, and that'll be perfectly fine. But the sofer, or the Adam, the shliach, they might not be alive anymore. Or they might have gone and they might have disappeared from the scene. So therefore, it becomes more perilous in terms of appointing these particular people. He says, no problem. What does it say in the Mishnah? In Gittin Daf Samach Vav Manal, if a person is mushlach babor, he says, kol ha-shomeis koli yiktov get liishti. Whoever hears my voice can write a get to my wife. So you could say, whoever is in this city, okay? And if he's near a city, he can say, whoever is in the nearby city, who's able to write a get, sign a get, they're all appointed by me. You can have, and that's considered to be a direct appointment. The yichte, that's considered to be like he is appointing them directly. So he says you could do that, particularly if you're, now, here's where you run into a problem. If you don't have a sofer and Adam directly in front of him, so then you get into the question of, can you appoint somebody directly when the person is not standing there? That's a machlokus. And the Ramban says no, but the Ra'ah the Ran and the Ra'ah say that as long as it's a direct appointment, that's considered to be good enough. They're saying it lahalacha, not lamaisa, but the Maharshal said that you can rely upon it lamaisa. Plus, you add that together. I'm not going to spend a long time in this thing, and this has to go into what's considered to be direct appointments. Huge machlokes as to whether a person who is a pikeach, who has all of his faculties, is allowed to authorize a get to be written when if he's only doing it in writing. He's only doing it in writing, so that the sofer has a direct appointment because he has the piece of paper in front of him, but the person didn't sign it directly in the presence of the sofer. Is that considered to be good or not? The Gemara says we reject the opinion of Rav Kahana, who says that if a cherish would do this, it would be good. We say that's no good, but maybe it's only a cherish. The Rambam says if it's an ishtatek, somebody who's not able to speak, but he's capable, he's mentally capable, fully capable, mentally capable, so then it is good. And the Beis Yosef thinks that the Rambam means lav dafka nishtatek, but even if he's a pikeach who's able to speak, and he decides not to speak, he's only signing the document, that would also be good enough. The David HaMelech says if he's far away on the war, he's far away on the front, in the war, on the battlefront, so he doesn't necessarily have a sofer and Adam in front of him, so he can sign this document. Let him do two things. This is the solution. The Piskei Tshuva quotes in Siman Kuf Kaf Aleph, the Maharim Mibrisk, that the original Brisker, right? Maharim Mibrisk. So the Maharim Mibrisk says that we have the opinion of the Ramban and the Ra'ah, not the Ramban, the Ran and the Ra'ah, who say that Mina Shlo B'fanav is considered to be good. So let him articulate that I'm going to be appointing this sofer, this Eidim, the Shliach, and and anybody who sees my signature on this piece of paper, and let him sign the piece of paper. Signs the piece of paper. That's going to be good according to the Rambam, at least the way that the Beis Yosef understands the Rambam, and all is fine and good. Chazon Ish, really, just for the record, really didn't like the idea of authorizing to a Ksav Yad. Didn't like it at all. So he said, you're going to use a Ksav Yad. So just one thing to throw into the mix to make it better, because I think you need a Hisachtus. Not that you need the Bezdin of Hisachtus, but you need a Hisachtus of the Baal together with the Sof and the Eidim, that they have to be together at the same time, the same moment, a joining of the hearts and souls and so forth. That's the idea of a proper Lishma authorization, says the Chazon Ish. It's appointment by writing. If the Rambam ever said such a thing, that would only be if they were in the presence of the Bezdin. Some say, no, but Dafka, that's when you need only Nishtatek. If he could have done better, only like the David HaMelech's case, when there's a Tosefta that indicates like that. The only when the husband is not directly in front of the sofa and the Eidim, would we say that writing down when he could have spoken is going to be good enough, because he couldn't have spoken, because the sofa and Eidim are not directly in his presence. He's on the battlefront, and that's why he has to do it this particular way. That's more like Nishtatek. You could be making, well, the Chazon Ish says, throw into the mix, have the husband write his own get. Give him the text. How hard is it? How hard is it? Come on, who can't write a get? Just have him, by giving the text and have him, write the text of the get. And, and then he'll be able to have a point to shliach, and the get will be handed over to his wife. And this way, that avoids a lot of problems. The husband himself wrote the get, so then, you can really count upon that. That's much better than anything else. And everyone else said, nothing doing. That's for a perfect world. Maybe that works, but we don't live in a perfect world, and we can't rely upon the husbands to write valid Gittin, and therefore that suggestion of the Chazon Ish was never really adopted. But this idea of having this combination package, like the Marim Briska mentioned, in these cases where you have a sort of this signed document plus a verbal authorization, and certainly the best thing, says the David HaMelech, is if you actually have a sofer and Eidim and Shliach in front of you, and you could say, this is my dream team. I'll have a reserved group who may not be in front of me, everybody in the city, but my dream team that's right in front of me. You could do it that way, Matov Manoim. But if not, so then you have this idea of everybody signing these harshos. Now the David HaMelech did not talk about having it necessarily delivered at a later point in time, but the Minchas Eluzar. Minchas Eluzar and others, Rabbi Jachter in his article quotes from some great uncle of his, David Singer. I'm not sure who that was, but he was apparently also was very big on this suggestion. So Minchas Eluzar goes further, and he says that you can stipulate in the Harsha that the get not be written until the person is missing for a period of time after the war. That, in other words, so who says that the Harsha has to be written a week later, or even a month later, or even a year later? Wait until the war is over. And the Minchas Elazar doesn't actually have a time frame that he says that you put in the document. Don't write the get for 1 year after the war is over. It just says you wait until the smoke is cleared, and then you see whether the person is still missing in action. And then he recommended, he said that this is his formulation. It was changed. The way that it ended up being done, at least in modern times, and I think this is the formulation that Rav Herzog in the Heichel Yitzchak came up with, was to write explicitly, wait 12 months after the war is over. I have a problem with that a little bit, because as we've discovered, even in modern times, how do you define the war being over? And they talk about, after all the captives are freed. How do you define after all the captives are freed? Let's say you know that there are 2 or 3 captives who are still missing in action, or you think were not freed. I think you have to be very, very careful about setting benchmarks. One of the advantages of Minchas Elazar is that he stayed away a little bit from setting these benchmarks, to say at the time that the Bezdin thinks that it's appropriate to write the get, something like that. And then he recommended that the Bezdin itself wait for 12 months, because then you have, if you're especially in a situation you're not sure the husband is dead or alive, you have the advantage, like the Shulchan Aruch talks about in Siman Yud Zayin, of never zichro. A woman whose husband disappeared in Mayim Shein Lemsov. So if it's never zichro, that his memory has been forgotten, because as far as we're concerned, he's wiped off the face of the earth. Nobody has heard from him in 12 months. So we say, Imnises lo teitze. So you have the advantage of the 12-month period as well. So he said, wait at least 12 months until you can say that as well. So then you have the Yom Shach, that the wife could remarry, and there also would be no problem if he returns from battle. No get was ever written, right? If he comes back right after the battle and wasn't necessary to write the get, you know what else we've been able to resolve? That she's able to come back to her husband who is a Kohen. Come back to her husband as a Kohen. If you use this Harsha approach, right? This Harsha approach of having the get authorization when it's not even written until after the war is over, she'd be able to go back if he survives. Then he can go back to his wife because there never was a get, even though he is a Kohen. It doesn't work for one type of situation. What's that? The situation of Yibum Chalitza. Since we're relying on the fact that we're not sure if he's dead or alive. If he's dead, he's dead. And if he's alive, so then the get at least is going to be good, right? Since there's a possibility that he's dead by the time we write the get, so the wife is not going to be spared from Yibum Chalitza. But in my experience, I have not had many aguna situations relating to Yibum Chalitza where there's a brother who's around who's refusing to do Chalitza. Or what they were really worried about was not only that, they were worried about the battle is taking place. You have a young man who just got married. When did they get married in those days? You think they waited till they were 20 or 22 years old, like in yeshiva? No. They got married at like 14, 15, whatever. You know, sometimes they get married 18. They get married young, and sometimes the next oldest brother would be 4 years old. Sometimes. So then you'd have to wait like a good 9 years until he'd be bar mitzvah before he'd be able to do chalitza. That was also one of the issues that they dealt with. So I haven't seen so many chalitza guna situations. I have seen a couple, but no, not by a hand. I can count them in the fingers of one hand. I've seen them, but so therefore you can't necessarily resolve everything, but you resolve as much as you possibly can. But points out the minchas alaz, and now we have a new problem. What's the new problem? Who says that the husband is of sound mind at the point in time in which we're going to write the get? If you're going to write the get right away, you're going to give over the get right away, so you know he's of sound mind. But the get was given over. Al Tanai, good, it was given, but at least he gave it over. So Al Tanai is perfectly, that works, regardless of whether he's going to be of sound mind 10 months later. If the get is given over unconditionally, so sound mind, so that works perfectly fine. But if he's missing in action, I don't know if he's of sound mind or not. So how do I know that he's still shafet b'daito? So he gives a few different answers. He says, I have sfeik sfeika. Two different versions of sfeik sfeika. I don't understand the first one at all. I don't understand it. I'll say it. I don't understand it though. Okay, so don't ask me to explain it because I don't understand it. He says, okay, that maybe he wasn't wounded, and meaning that nothing happened that would cause him to lose mental capacity. There's nothing bad happened to his body, whatever, or he didn't have an illness. Okay, and even if he was wounded or ill, maybe he's still shafei b'daito. I don't know. I don't understand. To me, it's all the same thing, same suffix. Okay, but anyway, then he has a second suffix. Sfeik sfeika. The second sfeik sfeika that I get. That's the sfeik sfeika that we all been working with. Okay, says maybe he's dead, and if he's alive, maybe he's of sound mind. Okay, good. Well, that sfeik sfeika makes a lot of sense. Furthermore, we have the Gemara Daf Chav Ches Amud Mesechus Gittin says somebody brings a get Medina Sayam from somebody who was a choler or zaken. We assume he's b'cheskas chai, and the get can be given over, even though he was a zaken or a choler. It's the same way we assume he was b'cheskas. We could assume that we can follow the cheskas chai. We can tell the cheskas chai. Same way we can tell a chazaka in terms of cheskas shafet b'daito. That if we assume that he was just like we left him alive, even though he's sick, even though he's old, we still assume he's alive. So then we have the right to still assume that he is a bar das, right? However, I will add a however, which is maybe this is not true in the situation where I know maybe he's dead, okay? But if he's alive, where is he? He's with Hamas. And it's been for over a year. And is it really such a suffix that, maybe he's of sound mind? Because maybe once you have a passage of a certain amount of time, there's a greater probability that, unfortunately, the person might not be of sound mind. If we know that they're in the hands of certain types of terrorists, if that's the type of suffix that we have. I don't know. I'm just raising that I'm not sure. Right, I'm not sure. I'm just saying. Unfortunately, I say this, with great, sadness, and with great trepidation. But I don't know. Okay. Now, the next issue is the issue of the furloughs, right? Okay. So what do you do if the husband is going to come back? Isn't that automatically going to be a bittul? Particularly if I have a harsha. There's a Rambam in Hilchos Gerish in Perek Tes Halacha Chaf Hey. The Rambam says explicitly. He says, Kal v'chomer. Nobody understands this Kal v'chomer. He says, Kal v'chomer, woman already received a get, now she's alone with her husband, and we say the get is no good. It's not true. What do you mean? It means you need a new get. You need a new get because we say they're yichud with each other. So Kal v'chomer, in a situation where the get wasn't even written yet, and it was only authorized, and then the husband goes and he's miyachid, he's together with his wife, so then for sure the get is batil. We assume he was mevatel the get. The Ramban says, I don't understand this Kal v'chomer at all. Doesn't make any sense. What are you going to say? Maybe there was pius. Maybe that he was mephias her. They were mephias each other. That now he doesn't want. She was mephias him. That he doesn't want to do the get anymore because now they were together. But do you really have to assume that would be the case? He says. So the Ramban says, okay, it's a kshash. It's a kshash. Says Shulchan Aruch follows the Ramban. It says it's not a get bato. It's a suffix gerushin. In Simon Kof Mem Ches, Kof Mem Tes, Sifta Zayin. It's a suffix gerushin. And if you look closely in the Ramban is much more tame than that. Ramban really says, yeah, you're worried, Sheriff. Yeah, you can get over that. You can say, if he says, Nemenis alike, Me'edim, that I believe her, that she says that there was no pierce, that's good enough. It's like the Gemara in Ayim Vavim Manab Beis. Mesechus Gittin, where the fellow says this is a get, if as long as I after 30 days, even though I might, come into town from time to time, as long as I'm not going to be miyak with you, it's a get. And the Gemara says, why aren't we worried that maybe they were miyak? So the Gemara says he said ne'emenes alai, that she's believed that we didn't have yichud with each other, so that should be good enough for this type of situation. But it's paskin in Shulchan Aruch that it's no better. That's the language in the Shulchan Aruch. That it's no better than a suffix get. So Rav Moshe had the idea, I think this was in connection with Vietnam, this is in Chelik Daled Simon Kuf Yirav Nebuchadnezzar, where he says that you allow for the person, when he makes the appointment for a get to be written, there should be a get that's written up and that's delivered right away, al tanai. But Moshe was okay doing a get al tanai. I have no idea why. Nobody seems to have any idea whether this Eitz of Rav Moshe was followed. But even Rav Chaim Ozer has a tshuva that's published in the Hechel Yitzchak, I think in Even Ezra Chelik Beis Siman Lamed Vav, where she also says, in World War I, we didn't like these new Eitzos, the Divrei Malkim, Minchas Elazar. No, we did it the old-fashioned way. We did it tonight. I don't know. Who's come to it? The Yochel Shoka saying, never saw it, get out tonight. I don't understand. It's hard to relate to. So Moshe had the idea, do it tonight. And that the get will be valid, if he doesn't come back or whatever. And then, if for whatever reason the Bezdin decides that it became bato because they were together during this time before it would become valid, so he authorizes for new Gittin to be written. He authorizes that you could just have an endless stream of new Gittin which are written. Rav Henkin had a chiddush that if there's a furlough and he's with his wife, so have him do even a new, when he comes back to see his wife, do a new nisuin, but make the nisuin al tanai, that if he doesn't return, so it'll turn out the nisuin were never a valid nisuin. Rav Henkin said at a certain point in time, the Hadribi, any eitzos about doing a nisuin al tanai, he was choser, whatever. But still, they had this idea of doing a get al tanai. But that's not that solution for the furloughs has not generally been followed. The solution that's followed is found in the Ber Heitev. Ber Heitev in Siman Kuf Mem Ches. There's a long Ber Heitev. At the very end, he sneaks something in. He goes, I can sneak in at the end. Nobody's going to notice. They sneak something in at the very end. And he quotes from Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi. Eliyahu Mizrahi, who's that? Really a late Rishon, but we call him an Achor. Call him an Achor, whatever. I don't know. So Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi had said a person's going out in Medina Sayyam for 3 years, doesn't know if he'll return. The waters and the pathways are the water and the highways, whatever. It's very perilous. Doesn't know if he's going to return. So we don't want his wife. Maybe he'll be missing in action. We don't want his wife to be an aguna. So we have him authorize. He authorizes a get. Says but don't have the get given and don't have the get written for 3 years. Don't have it given. He's authorizing a get. Says don't have the get written for 3 years. If I don't come back in 3 years, then you go back to get. But then there's like a delay in action before he ends up leaving, and he spends some time with his wife. So is the get still considered to be a good get? He says, 100%, because he's writing the get for his wife's well-being in order that she shouldn't be an aguna. So of course he's not going to be mevatel the get if he ends up spending a little bit of time with his wife. It's so interesting. The Maritatz, who lived 100 years later, has a tshuva about this situation, and mamish, it's the same fact pattern. It's the same fact pattern. Look, it's in the Yeshuas Yishanos Kufay and Hey. The tshuva of the Re'im is in the Mayim Amukim, Simin Hey, Chelik Aleph Simin Hey, the Mayim Amukim. I don't get it. They're both the same Shiloh. It's the same Shiloh. But it's 100 years apart.
But they used to do this all the time.
Yeah.
The Maharasham would have a Shiloh.
Oh, okay, fine. So it's
a door later, they would bring it up.
a door later. It's 100 years later. It's 100 years later. So okay. It's just an interesting feature of Shiloh Suchuvas literature. It's mamish 100 years later, and they're both mekel. So Rebbe Yom Mizrahi, the Re'im is mekel about this situation. He's mekel about this situation. He says that's the mashmos of the whole, as we mentioned earlier, of the whole Tosas and Suvos regarding Uri Achiti, that it doesn't matter if he came back in the middle, as long as he didn't come back at the end. So then we assume that there was no bittul, and here too, with respect to the harsha, we assume that there's no bittul. But what do you do? What do you do with the Rambam? The question is, Rabbi Yom Mizrahi, if you look in the tshuva, he says, yeah, I know I'm going against the Rambam. I know I'm going against the Rambam. You think, I know I'm going against the Rambam. But he says, I can go against the Rambam because a lot of people disagree with the Rambam. The Ramban, the Rashba, they disagree. They say that the get is still going to be kosher, even if there's yichud in the middle, is perfectly fine. As long as, what did the Ramban say? Our version of the Ramban, according to the Beis Shmuel, the Shulchan Aruch is passing like the Ramban says, Safek Megureshis. But the Ramban really said, yeah, okay, maybe worry Shem appears, but if he says Nemenes Alai, so then it's perfectly fine. So he says, yeah, this is like a Nemenes Alai situation, perfectly fine, therefore I'm not worried about it. But the kasha, the bigger kasha is, why wouldn't at least the Ber Heitev, who's quoting Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, note that this case, this ruling that he's bringing, is directly against what's officially in Shulchan Aruch. We don't have any dissenting view in the Shulchan Aruch. He just quotes it as if, oh yeah, this is like the most obvious thing, that this is going to be perfectly fine. So why doesn't he at least note that this is against what it says in the in the Shulchan Aruch? So the Chazon Ish in Siman Kuf Hey, the Sifkat and Yotes, also relates to this, and he says, well, maybe that this is, he brings the same answer, basically, that appears in Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi. Maybe we're talking about a case where he gave her ne'emonus, and therefore he says that even though that we know that they were mesiaker with each other, since he said that she was ne'emenes, that there was lo pies, that there was no appeasing. So therefore, we would say that she's believed kamei edim, and you don't have to worry about get yashon because the get wasn't written yet. So he says maybe that's what's really going on over here. So Tzitz Eliezer, very interestingly, quotes of Yecheskel Abramsky with an answer to this, which is a very, very fascinating answer. And he gives the following answer from Yecheskel Abramsky. And this answer is really one that is found in the Maritatz. The Maritatz that I just quoted for you says exactly the same thing as Rav Yecheskel Abramsky, which is we're not worried about the Shita of the Rambam in this particular case. Why is that? Because the whole purpose of the whole reason why we would be worried of the get becoming batil is based on the context. What do you mean the context? The context is that if the man is coming back and he has a potential expectation that he's never going to leave again because he doesn't have to leave again, so then I'm worried about the possibility of pius. But if he's totally b'das acherim, namely that we're dealing with somebody who's out at war, and it's not up to him to be able to stay home, and the whole thing that he was worried about is that something's going to happen to him at war, and that concern is not going to go away because he is totally b'das acherim. So therefore, in this particular case, you certainly would not. Mela, he says, move on. This is how the Tzitz Eliezer quotes him. Move on. Shekol zman shu zakuk lotze shenis batzava eno mevatel as pikudaso al sidor aget unesinaso liyada isha achar zman amugbal. So therefore, he says that because of that consideration, that it's not completely up to him. So he's totally b'das acherim. that's the reason why the get would be assumed that not to be nullified. The Maritatz, interestingly, brings another raya really for this position from the fact that the Rambam himself in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Gittin paskins like the Gemara Yevamas on Daf Nun Beis, that if a man authorizes a sofer to write a get, and he says, "Ksuv get larusasi," write a get for my betrothed one, okay? So that I could do the ultimate wedding gift. When I marry her, I'll be able to divorce her with this get. So we say, the Rambam says, great, no problem. What do you mean no problem? He's authorizing a get to be written. Why aren't we worried about Shema Pies by the time he's going to be delivering the get to his wife? It's going to be after there is a marriage ceremony, right? He says that I'm going to divorce my wife with the get after I marry her, and why don't we worry about Shema Pius? So he explains, Kiman demetchila nakis lahachi v'kavana zu nasa. Since that was the whole kavana of him marrying her, was to give her this get. Leika lemecha Shema kishibaleh Pius mishum de'daita dahaki nachis. So you don't have to worry that there was some sort of a pius, an appeasement between them, because that was like the whole purpose of this get. So here too, the whole purpose of this get, and only in the Rabbi Yom Mizrahi case, the whole purpose is that he knows he's going away for 3 years no matter what, and he wants her to be protected for that 3-year period. Here, the soldier knows that he's going to continuously be in the war, and he wants his wife to be protected during that period. So therefore, in the furlough period, he's not going to be canceling the get. And certainly, if you do, like the explanation of Rabbi Yom Mizrahi himself, you have built in to the harsha that the woman is nemenes alai, that she's believed kamei edom, that there was no pius, that we did not appease, that I was not mevatel the get. So then that certainly should work, and you can throw into the mix as well. And this is what he also quotes from the Maharitats, that Tzitz has the very same tshuva of the Maharitats, that in the event that the husband took upon himself b'chayrim of shvuas haTorah. Aldas bezdin shlo levatel asageh v'lo as shlichus. He took on with a serious Torah oath. This is the only time we administer oaths. Bisman is that we don't administer oaths nowadays. It's a general rule. We worry about the earthquakes. That the whole world is going to shake and quiver, like at the time the third amendment was given over. But nonetheless, we allow it when it comes to an appointment. A man who appoints a shliach to deliver a get, he takes a shvuas haTorah, that he's not going to be mevatel the get over the shlichus. So he says, we take the man who's going to take a shvuas haTorah, that he's never going to be mevatel even when it comes for furlough. So then that could be, perfectly fine. I'm going to throw a monkey wrench into this, which is this entire svara that he quotes from Rav Abramsky, the idea that he's totally b'das acherim. Not everybody utilizes this svara, but this is the lashon of the Rav Abramsky quoted by the Tzitz Eliezer, totally b'das acherim, because he knows when he comes in for the furlough, he's still being brought back into the army. May not work bisman hazeh for a certain type of situation. If it's a weekend, yeah, Shabbos off 100%. But what's been going on a lot in this war? What's been going on is that you have soldiers who are released from action, and the family breathes a sigh of relief. Oh, finally, after 4 months, 6 months, 15 months, whatever in Gaza, they're finally home. And then 3 months later, there's a new offensive, and they need more soldiers back, and they're called back again from Miluim. But they don't necessarily have the expectation. On the one hand, they're totally b'das achem. On the other hand, maybe they have the feeling that they're going to stay there for a while. Or maybe they have the feeling that even if I'm called again, maybe I won't go. Because I don't know that everyone necessarily goes every single time that they're called back nowadays. It's complicated. It's complicated right now. That's why there's this whole push about drafting more people into the army, because there's a lot of calling back over and over again. There might be, at least according to the svara of Abramsky, there might be a distinction between a furlough and when the person is actually discharged, but then there's just a possibility that they might be called back in from Miluim. Then maybe that really, according to his svara, should require a new harsha. There's a beautiful svara of Rav Herzog. You look in source 20. Rav Herzog himself, who really, he was the Ashkenazic chief rabbi at the time of the forming of the Medina. He's the one who came up with a harsha that was supposed to be used by the army at the time of the Milchemes HaShichrur, at the time of the War of Independence, right? So he says, look at the bold type in source 20, V'onimuk, I have another explanation as to why it should work in this case. He's not quoting the tension between the Psak and the Shulchan Aruch based on the Rambam on the one hand and the Re'im on the other hand. He's just quoting why is it that we're comfortable with this idea of a get mechama. He says v'onimuk lama yavatel. Shash said lo nemar el barosa the garish esishto machmasina. I only am worried about bittul when the person originally commissioned the get, because why do most people want to give a get to their wife? Because they hate their wife. They're angry at their wife. They want to get rid of their wife. But this person wants to give get because out of love. That's also the Alzheimer's cases. We describe it. This is a get which is given out of love, so that she shouldn't be an aguna, but they love each other. There's no basis. The Rambam wasn't talking about this type of a case. If it's a bittul that originally the get was authorized because of sinner, so when there's abba afterwards, so then that's a tension, that's a contradiction. Maybe there was pius. However, if it started out with abba, so then when you have the get was only commissioned because of abba, if they have abba, but they're together with each other afterwards, that's not a contradiction, and that is not a tension. That is not a nullification in any way. It's a continuation of the same agenda that he's looking to protect his wife, so he continues to want to protect his wife, and that's the reason why we would assume that this would still be okay. So it doesn't work. I had a case from Florida that I was called about at the beginning of the war after October 7th, where there was a fellow who was called up. He was an Israeli citizen. He was called up from Florida that he had to go to Eretz Yisrael to join the war effort, and he figured to himself, he wanted to divorce his wife anyway. They weren't particularly getting along with each other, but he figured, I'm not going to have so much time next week to take care of the get. So he went to the local Rav, the local Bezdin, and he asked if they could just maybe at least have him get authorization at this point in time, that he would come home for a few days, that he wasn't exactly sure which day he would get the flight to go up to Israel, and he would go off at that point in time. Could he do the authorization right now? So I said, according to the Tzitz Eliezer, that was his case, where a fellow was about to go to a special mission before, the 6-day war. But he was doing it out of Ava, so that would be okay. According to Yom Mizrachi, it would be okay. But in this case, where he wants to do it out of sinna, he wants to do it that he really wants to divorce his wife, so then it might actually be a potential bittul shema pies if he's going to be with her after the authorization. If it goes on, I said this is the one case where it's not going to work. But we actually had a number of cases where people really did come to us and they wanted to authorize this type of a get milchama, both in connection with the October 7th war. Yes, Hashem should be over Bekarov, Bezras Hashem Yisbarach, and all the chatufim, all these hostages should come back free and mushlemim. But we had a few cases of this war, and also when I was working in the Bez in 2004, when we had the Iraqi war, around 2000, from 2002 2004, that period of time, people were going out into the army, and we were giving them forms at that point in time. I found in my files just one letter where I sent the form to somebody. This is a chaplain's office in Great Lakes, Illinois. I live in Illinois. I have no idea what Great Lakes, Illinois is. But I was sending this to somebody from the chaplain's office. They said, pursuant to our conversation, dear Rabbi so-and-so, enclosed, please find a halakhic living will, blah, blah, and a military kisru tanu form with instructions for implementation. Well, that's we've had it. The Bezdin of America has forms going back to World War II. World War II is before you had the specific form that was devised by Rav Herzog. So this doesn't have the language of furloughs. There were no furloughs. They would have to the war in World War II. There were no furloughs. You didn't have to worry about that language. But they have it's both in English, and they have, it's interesting, there are two languages that it's written in English and Yiddish. English and Yiddish. The date is December 30th, 1942. It's the official Bezdin RCA form. Bezdin America wasn't officially formed until 1960. And it says, it gives you instructions what to do. If you have a Jewish chaplain, make sure to see him a few days before, and the chaplain shall arrange to have 2 other Jews present to form a tribunal. If you have no Jewish chaplain, let 3 Jewish laymen or 3 Jewish soldiers act as tribunal and sign the forms A, also B, or C after instructions have been followed. In space for Sofer, inscribe the name of Yoshua, Meir ben Shlomo. I don't know who these people are. In space for witnesses, Eliezer ben Eliyahu, Abba, and Levi Yitzchak ben Meir Chaim. In space for the shliach, put in again the sofer, Yoshua Meir ben Shlomo. That's the general practice, to use the sofer also as the shliach. We see they were doing that in 1942 as well. And after that, the form also has this language in which it says, I also appoint anyone who will see my signature on this form to act as sofer to write a divorce to my above-mentioned wife, and any two will see my signature on this form to act as witnesses to sign the get, and anyone who will see my signature on this form, like call a shomeas koli, right, to deliver the divorce called get to my above-mentioned wife, and then it's just basically a standard form, and it doesn't give any time instructions as to when it should be written or delivered, but it's just sort of understood that this would only be done in the event that the soldier would not come back from war. And they write at the end, it is our fervent prayer that this war may soon end. This is late 1942. Well, it ended 3 years later. And permanent world peace be established, let it not be necessary to use these forms, that our men serving the armed forces of the U.S. shall soon return home to their families safe and sound with a banner of victory for God and country. Okay, very beautiful formulation, but this was actually used. If you looked in, I remember seeing in the files of the Bezdin, I don't know, I asked Rabbi Weissman to try to dig up, more forms. I seem to remember seeing filled out forms from the Vietnam War, but I don't have them. I don't have copies of those right now, but I certainly have the forms, the Kisru Tanu forms that we gave out at the time, back in 2004. The only thing that we added under those circumstances was the language along the lines of what the Rabbanut had recommended in 1948, which is, under no circumstance this get shall be written and delivered only when it is determined by any single member of the Betin that I am unlikely to return from military service, and I write this get to release my wife from the chains of Igun. Under no circumstances shall this get be written within a year of my disappearance. Okay, that's a benchmark that's a little easier to satisfy, right? And that also means you're not going to write it if you know the person's in captivity, but just you give up hope that they'll ever be released. Okay. I explicitly state that even if I should return to be with my wife on occasion after this document is signed and we reside together as a couple, I am not nullifying this appointment of an agency to write, sign, and deliver the get to my wife. My wife shall be believed as 100 witnesses that I never nullified this agency. I undertake with all seriousness, even with an oath of the Torah, that I would not nullify the effectiveness of the get or the power of the above-mentioned messenger to deliver it to my wife. And of course, it also has the language that says that if anybody of these individuals will be unable or unwilling to fulfill the task I report to them to do, anyone who will see my signature on this form could be a sofa. Any two witnesses who see my signature form, my agent to deliver the bill of divorce, and any two witnesses who see my signature on this form to act as witnesses, and anyone who sees my signature on the form to act as my agent to deliver the bill of divorce at the get. So it has all of those Lashonos as well. And those are basically the Lashonos in the Hebrew form that was utilized and recommended by the Rabbanut, going back to the beginning of the Milchemes HaShichrur that was put into effect. But what happened was, this is what they say happened. What happened was the soldiers didn't want to sign it. So the Mifkadim pointed out to the local rabbis who were in charge of the army at that time. I don't know exactly when Rabbi Goren got involved. Was it during the war, right after the war? I don't know. But they pointed out that the soldiers don't want to sign it. And this went up to went all the way to Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion said there's a good article that summarizes all this by Rabbi Michal Yamir, the Rosh Yeshiva Shalvim, who says that the person who put a stop to using these forms because they felt that the soldiers didn't want to sign it because they felt it was bad for their morale, because they were worried, that suddenly my marital relationship is already in jeopardy. So it was David Ben Gurion. David Ben Gurion put a stop to it. Says, we're not going to allow this. And that's the official policy of the army to this day. There are those who question the policy. After all, as I mentioned, this is part of our long-standing tradition. Rabbi Blackschliet has an article on this too. It's part of our long-standing tradition from the times of Milchemes Beis David, that this was, from Moshe Rabbeinu, that this was something that we always did. Rabbi Yaakov Ariel points out, what do you mean you're worried about morale? They all have these dog tags with all their personal ID information. If anything should happen to them, they have to give in their dental records. What do you mean this is going to be bad for their morale just because they're authorized? They have other things that they do to anticipate the possibility of things happening during war. Why should this be bad for the morale? However, Rav Asher Weiss is also quoted by Rav Yama as saying that the whole halachic discussion doesn't get off the ground because of the fact that we have to worry about the morale of the soldiers. Very, very interesting. He's quoted as saying that. In an earlier article, the Second Lebanon War, Rav Asher Weiss expressed 3 reasons why he's not a fan of doing this from a halachic perspective. 3 reasons he's not, and he mentioned this in the beginning of this war. He had a special conference call for rabbis. He was talking about lots of things. One of the things they spoke about was get milchama, and he said, somebody came to me, and he's going out to the war, and he asked me, a soldier, asked me if I would do a get milchama harsha for him, and I said, I don't think it's a good idea to do it because it's not something that would make sense to do on a wholesale basis, and there are halachic issues with it. However, since you've asked me, I don't want to leave you empty-handed. I give you a bracha that you should come back from the army safe and sound. And supposedly that's what the disciple did when people would come to him with this request. That's what's reported anyway. But his 3 objections are as follows. First objection is that what was the machlokas Rashi and Beinu Tam? One of them said, give a get, I'll tanai. The other one said, give a get, not I'll tanai, unconditional. Nobody's giving a get over here. He says, only a harsha is the lack of gemiras das. It's being done like a person just signing a bunch of paperwork, your financial forms, whatever you're signing your documents before you go in for surgery. Just get them out of my way so I can go on with life. People are not paying the attention. Instead of doing it, it's mitzvahs. If you're going to have it on a wholesale basis, it'll be mitzvahs anashim melumada, or maybe based on lachatz chevrati. So he says it is maybe along the lines of like an asmachta problem over here, whether you have the requisite gemiras das. Number 2, he says he is worried about the concern that was registered by the Minchas Ulaz. He doesn't say why he's not satisfied with any of his terutzim. I gave you a reason to be worried in our circumstances, but he said he's worried that maybe there'll be a lack of das, a lack of shifoy das, a mental capacity at the time in which the get is actually written. You don't have that problem with Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam, but you do have that problem nowadays. And he says, and this is the more common thing he says, because otherwise, and now he wrote this at the time of the Second Lebanon War. I don't know that anyone could have anticipated the circumstances of this terrible predicament that we're in right now with Hamas. But he said that the more common situation is that if somebody really is of sound mind, then you'd be able to find them. Nowadays, we know where the captives are kept. You have agencies that can get across to the captive. And if we needed a requisite authorization, we'd be able to have it at that time. If you're not able to get through to the person at all, then it creates a more of a probability that there's a lack of mental capacity. And then the third critique that he had is he said, nowadays with advanced technology, that we know what's happening with the shvuyim and also with the various rules of war that have to be followed by the nations, there really aren't so many captives. And if there are captives, they're not going to want to keep them that long because of all of the international restrictions relating to having hostages and the like. So therefore, it's so sad. It's so sad, that when you see the world regress, it's so sad. And therefore, he said that it doesn't make sense to have a tikkun klali when you talk about having a tikkun for everybody. So it has to be something that really makes sense in most situations, and here it doesn't really make sense. So I would say that certainly maybe if it's within Eretz Yisrael, again, the person who came to the Tzitz Eliezer was before the 6-day war, when already it wasn't the official IDF policy to do these forms. He had no problem. Doing the form for a particular person who came to him, and we don't have a problem either. If you have a particular individual who comes, I think halacha, wins out. And you don't have, we're not making a tikkun klali. The person's not doing it based on mitzvahs anashim melumada. If they're coming to us, then it shows that they really very much care about it. And you don't have to worry about a morale problem, because if they're asking for it, it means it's good for their morale. So I would think, at least for those people who come to us, it makes a lot of sense. There was no official RCA form that was promulgated in connection with this war, but we have the standard RCA form that was sent out in 2004 and so forth. I didn't ask them whether they sent out in this particular war how many forms have been sent out. We have a standard form from the CRC that we've used as well, along with the same language that I quoted to you. This rabbi in Beit Shemesh came up with his own form, and in his form he says since I am appointing, these people to write the get. He doesn't even start off though with appointing a particular sofer or particular edim, just assuming that the person is already somewhere where there's no, I mean, it makes sense. Even if he's somewhere where there's no sofer edim, he still has people who are going to be citing this, so you really should appoint a particular sofer edim, and he just says, no, es kol ha-Yehudim, shekiblu smicha l'rabanut mitam ha-rabanut ha-rashit li-Yisrael, o shem chaverim mistadrut ha-rabbanim d'America. I'm appointing anybody who receives smicha from the chief rabbinate or from the RCA, right? They go together, as we all know, joined at the hip, right? Shekol echad mehem she'yirtzeh said any one of them, she'yiktov ged li'ishti, who has the following tudat sahut, official form, and so forth. Shekol shneim mehem hakshem le'edus yaktem le'gev. Shekol echad mehem hakosher l'holacha. Yitain es aget li'ishti. I would hope they won't kosher for all these things. Yitain es li'ishti. Yitain es aget li'ishti anis keres, etc., etc. Maybe unless they're a relative, etc., etc. And then he throws in, for good measure, okay, and so he writes, so what's the time frame? If it's found out that I'm amongst the missing, or the person he's presumed dead, but it's not good enough halakhically to come to the conclusion, puts in explicitly the 1 year mark. Only then should the get be written, and he has the whole thing about that my wife should be believed that I wasn't mevatel, mekabel is shvu, and all those things. But he added a line. What line did he add? Oh, you can also write the get. La'achar shetifne ishti leveisim v'yisbare b'fneim shenafalti lecholi shebegino lo uchal legarish es. This is what I told him, that don't jump the gun on this one. Don't jump the gun. This right now the halacha is, and I have to, for the foreseeable future, the halacha is this doesn't work. This doesn't work. Okay, but he put it in. He put it into the form. I think there's probably severability, that the rest of the form is probably still valid, but just an interesting development in terms of what was put in the form under these in this particular case. So lemaisa, I think that it is something which is still very relevant. Unfortunately, in these types of situations, it's not being done on a wholesale basis, but it is or a grand scale basis. But it is something which still has halakhic relevance and could be helpful in certain situations. Even if for whatever reasons you follow, like what Rav Asher Weiss said, not to make it a Takana Sibor, for those people who want it, it certainly is a sound practice, and one which, for purposes of just inaugurating the Chaburus in Hilchos Gittin for this year, on my part, I think is a good topic to speak about, because it's one which helps us all remember some of the goals and purposes and yesodas of the Hilchos Gerushin. Oh, Solowski, how are you? Pleasure to see you. I want to get hold of your sefer. Okay.
If you go down
Yeah.
the back shelf.
Back shelf. Yeah.
Well, it's on the house.
Okay, excellent. Great. Thank you so much. Okay, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I don't know if it's paper or Solowski, but
See you over. Yeah.
I remember in November, corner was chapter in the elevator.
Yeah.
Muted endorsement.
Oh, here.
I got from him a muted endorsement on Trump. And later this year,
A muted endorsement
for Donald Trump.
for what? For what purpose?
For
What are you gonna use it